The Arizona sun hung like a merciless eye above the McCready ranch, baking the earth until it cracked like broken pottery. Tom McCready wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse toward the barn, the day's heat still radiating from the adobe walls of his modest homestead. 3 years of solitary living had carved deep lines around his grey eyes, and his calloused hands told the story of a man who worked alone because he had no choice. His cattle had been restless all morning, lowing and shifting in their pen as if sensing something amiss. Tom had spent the better part of the day checking fence lines and water troughs, finding nothing obvious to explain their agitation. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the jagged horizon, he needed to tend to his horse and secure the barn for the night. The wooden door creaked on its leather hinges as Tom pushed it open, the familiar smell of hay and leather greeting him. But something else lingered in the air, something that made his hand instinctively drift toward the Colt .45 on his hip. Years of frontier living had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that he wasn't alone. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing in the shadowy interior. "Anyone in here?" Silence answered him, but it was the wrong kind of silence, pregnant with held breath and fear. Tom's boots scraped against the hard-packed dirt floor as he moved deeper into the barn, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through gaps in the wooden slats. A rustling sound from the far corner made him freeze. There, huddled behind a stack of hay bales like a cornered animal, was a small figure. Tom's first thought was that a vagrant had taken shelter in his barn, but as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a child, a little Apache girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face streaked with dirt and tears. Her traditional deerskin dress was torn and stained with what looked like dried blood, though whether it was hers, he couldn't tell. Most striking were her eyes, wide dark pools filled with terror so profound it made Tom's chest tighten with an emotion he thought he'd buried with his own daughter. "Easy there, little one," Tom said softly, crouching down to make himself less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl pressed herself further back against the hay, her small hands clutching a crust of bread that she must have stolen from his kitchen. Her breathing was quick and shallow, like a trapped rabbit's. Tom noticed the way she favored her left side, suggesting an injury beneath the torn fabric of her dress. "You hungry?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "That bread's pretty stale. I've got better food in the house." No response. The girl's eyes darted between Tom and the barn door, clearly calculating her chances of escape. But her body language told him she was exhausted, possibly injured and definitely malnourished. Whatever had brought her to his barn, she'd been running for some time. Tom slowly reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a piece of jerky he'd been saving for later. He placed it on the ground between them and backed away. "There you go. Take it if you want it." The girl stared at the offering for a long moment, her survival instincts warring with her fear. Finally, hunger won. She darted forward like a bird, snatched the jerky, and retreated to her corner, tearing into the dried meat with desperate intensity. "When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" Tom asked, though he didn't expect an answer. The girl's condition suggested she'd been on her own for days, maybe weeks. "You got a name?" Again silence. But her eyes never left his face, studying him with an intelligence that reminded Tom painfully of his own daughter, Sarah, who would have been about this age now if the cholera hadn't taken her. Tom stood slowly, his knees protesting after the long day. "Well, I can't leave you out here. It gets cold at night, even in summer. And there's coyotes about." Or the mention of coyotes made the girl's eyes widen slightly, the first real reaction he'd gotten from her besides fear. Tom nodded toward the barn door. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up and fed proper. Then we'll figure out what to do." But as he turned toward the door, the girl whimpered, a small, broken sound that froze Tom in his tracks. When he looked back, she was shaking her head frantically, pointing toward the house with obvious terror. "You don't want to go inside?" Tom asked. The girl shook her head again, more violently this time. All right, we'll stay out here then." Tom walked to the barn entrance and looked out across his land toward the distant mountains where Apache smoke signals sometimes rose. Somewhere out there this child had family, before whatever tragedy brought her to his barn. The smart thing would be to ride into Copper Ridge tomorrow and turn her over to Sheriff Martinez. Let the authorities handle it. But as he glanced back at the frightened girl, clutching her stolen bread, Tom felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. The protective instinct of a father, awakened by a child who needed help, whether she wanted it or not. "Guess I'll be sleeping in the barn tonight too," he muttered, settling down on a pile of horse blankets. "Keep each other company." The girl watched him warily as he made himself comfortable. But as the sun finally disappeared behind the mountains and darkness crept into the barn, Tom heard the soft sound of her breathing gradually slow and deepen. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone with his ghosts. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Tom's hand found the grip of his pistol. Whatever had driven this child to his barn, whatever dangers were chasing her, they'd have to come through him first. The thought surprised him with its intensity. Maybe it was time to stop running from being needed. 3 days had passed since Tom found the Apache girl in his barn, and she still hadn't spoken a word. She'd accepted his presence with wary tolerance, taking the food he offered and allowing him to tend to the infected cut on her ribs, but she remained as silent as the desert stones. Tom had taken to calling her Little Bird in his mind, watching how she startled at every sound and seemed ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Tom emerged from the barn carrying a tin cup of fresh milk from his cow, Bessie. The girl, he'd given up trying to coax her real name out of her, sat cross-legged near the barn entrance, braiding grass stems with surprising skill. It was the first normal childhood behavior he'd witnessed from her. "Morning, Little Bird," Tom said softly, settling down a respectful distance away. "Brought you some milk. Bessie's the gentlest creature on this ranch, present company excluded." The girl's dark eyes flicked to the cup, then to his face. She'd learned over the past few days that he wouldn't force anything on her, that he'd simply leave offerings and wait. This morning, however, something was different. She reached for the cup without her usual hesitation, and when their fingers briefly touched as she took it, she didn't flinch away. "That's progress," Tom murmured, watching her drink. "You're starting to trust this old cowpoke." The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful moment. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he stood, recognizing the distinctive gait of multiple horses moving fast. The girl scrambled backward into the barn shadows, the milk cup forgotten in the dirt. "Easy, Little Bird," Tom said, his voice calm despite the tension in his shoulders. "Stay hidden." Sheriff Carlos Martinez rode into the yard with 2 of his deputies, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. Martinez was a fair man, caught between his Mexican heritage and his duty to keep peace in a territory where racial tensions ran as hot as the desert sun. His weathered face was grim as he dismounted. "Morning, Tom," Martinez called out, his spurs jingling as he approached. "Mind if we water our horses? It's been a long ride from town." "Help yourself," Tom replied, though his stance remained guarded. "What brings you out this way, Carlos? Don't usually see the law unless there's trouble brewing." Martinez gestured for his deputies to tend to the horses while he stepped closer to Tom. "There's been talk in town, Tom. Mrs. Henderson swears she saw an Apache child near your property when she was driving past 3 days ago. You know how folks get when there's Indian children wandering alone." Tom kept his expression neutral, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Mrs. Henderson's got poor eyesight and a vivid imagination. Probably saw a coyote pup." "Maybe so," Martinez said, but his eyes were sharp as they scanned the ranch yard. "But you know how it is, Tom. After what happened to the Patterson family last month, Apache raiders killed the father, took the mother and children. Folks are jumpy. They hear about a lone Indian child, and they start thinking revenge, thinking danger. The Pattersons were 40 miles north of here," Tom pointed out, And that was Chiricahua Apache, not local bands. Apache is Apache to most folks in Copper Ridge, Martinez said sadly. You know that as well as I do. If there was a child, Tom, hypothetically speaking, the safest thing would be to bring her to town. Let the territorial authorities handle it proper. From inside the barn came the faint sound of rustling hay. Tom coughed loudly to cover it, but Martinez's trained ear had caught something. The sheriff's hand moved casually toward his gun. Carlos, Tom said carefully, you've known me for 5 years. Have I ever given you cause to doubt my word? No, you haven't, Martinez admitted. But I've also never seen you look quite so protective over nothing, Tom. Your whole body's wound tighter than a spring. Before Tom could respond, one of the deputies called out from near the water trough, Sheriff, you need to see this. Martinez walked over to where Deputy Collins was crouched near the barn wall. Tom's stomach dropped as he saw what had caught the man's attention. Small footprints in the mud near the water barrel, clearly belonging to a child. Well now, Martinez said quietly, turning back to Tom. Those are mighty small prints for a coyote pup. Tom's mind raced through his options. He could deny it, but Carlos wasn't a fool. He could try to bluff, but that would only make things worse when the truth came out. Or he could trust a man he'd come to respect, even if it meant risking everything. She's hurt, Carlos, Tom said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Scared half to death and won't speak a word. Whatever happened to her family, it was bad. Martinez closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of his position heavy on his shoulders. Tom, you know I have to— Give me a week, Tom interrupted. Just 1 week to see if I can help her heal some before you take her away. She's not dangerous, Carlos. She's a traumatized child who needs someone to care about whether she lives or dies. The townspeople are already talking, Martinez said reluctantly. If word gets out that I knew and did nothing, then don't know, Tom said firmly. You came out here, you checked around, you found nothing conclusive. Give me 7 days to try and reach her. Martinez stared at Tom for a long moment, then glanced toward the barn, where a small shadow moved just inside the doorway. When he looked back at Tom, his expression was troubled but resolved. I don't see any Apache child here, he said loudly enough for his deputies to hear. Just old footprints that could belong to anyone. He lowered his voice. 1 week, Tom, but if trouble comes calling because of this, it's on your head. As the sheriff and his men mounted up to leave, Martinez paused beside Tom. For what it's worth, I hope you can help her. But be careful. There are folks in town who'd rather see her dead than adopted by a white man. And if her people come looking, I know the risks, Tom said quietly. After the lawmen disappeared down the dusty trail, Tom turned back to the barn. The girl stood just inside the entrance, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She'd understood enough of the conversation to know that Tom had protected her, had lied to the law to keep her safe. Come on out, little bird, Tom said gently. They're gone. She stepped into the sunlight, her gaze fixed on his face with something new, not trust exactly, but the beginning of it. For the first time since he'd found her, she took a step toward him instead of away. Tom felt something break open in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart after losing Sarah. This child needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed her too. We've got ourselves a week to figure this out, he told her softly. Think that's enough time for you to start trusting this old fool? The girl didn't answer, but she didn't run either. And for the first time in 3 days, she stayed close to Tom, instead of hiding in the shadows, as if she'd finally decided that some risks were worth taking. The 6th day of their fragile alliance dawned with an unnatural stillness that made Tom's weathered hands shake as he poured his morning coffee. Even his cattle seemed to sense the tension, huddling together in the far corner of their pen instead of spreading out to graze. The girl, who had finally begun responding to the name Little Bird with a slight nod, sat beside him on the porch step, sharing a breakfast of beans and hardtack. She'd made remarkable progress in just 5 days. Yesterday, she'd actually reached out and touched his hand when a rattlesnake had slithered too close to where she was sitting. The gesture was brief, instinctive, but it spoke of growing trust. She still hadn't uttered a single word, but her eyes followed Tom's movements with something approaching warmth rather than fear. "Storm coming," Tom muttered, studying the horizon where dark clouds gathered despite the morning sun. "Can feel it in my bones." What he felt was more than weather. 3 times in the past 2 days he'd spotted dust clouds in the distance, riders moving parallel to his property line but never approaching directly. Someone was watching the ranch, and Tom had a sinking feeling he knew who. The girl suddenly stiffened beside him, her small hand gripping his forearm with surprising strength. Tom followed her gaze toward the eastern ridge and felt his blood turn cold. 4 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, silhouetted against the morning sky like carved statues. Even at this distance, their presence radiated deadly intent. "Easy, little bird," Tom whispered, though his own pulse hammered in his throat. "Stay calm." The warriors began their descent down the rocky slope, moving with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. Tom could make out war paint on their faces and the distinctive headdress of what appeared to be their leader, a tall, powerfully built man who rode a magnificent pinto stallion. "Get inside the house," Tom told the girl softly, standing slowly to avoid any sudden movements that might provoke an attack. But Little Bird shook her head frantically, pointing toward the approaching warriors. For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed agitated rather than afraid. Her dark eyes were wide with recognition, and she made small, urgent sounds in her throat as if trying to speak. The Apache war party reached the ranch yard and spread out in a semicircle around Tom's porch. Their leader, a man in his 40s with scars marking his weathered face, urged his horse forward. When he spoke, his English was clear but heavily accented. "White man, you have something that belongs to my people." Tom kept his hands visible and away from his gun. "I have cattle, horses, and land. Nothing that belongs to anyone else." The warrior's eyes shifted to Little Bird, who had stepped out from behind Tom, despite his protective gesture. When she saw the leader's face clearly, she gasped, the first sound Tom had heard her make that wasn't born of fear or pain. "Aiyana," the warrior said, his voice heavy with emotion. "My sister's daughter. We have searched for you since the soldiers came." The girl, Aiyana, Tom realized, finally knowing her true name, took a trembling step forward. But instead of running to her uncle as Tom expected, she moved closer to Tom's side, her small hand finding his. The warrior's face darkened at this gesture. "The child has been bewitched by white man's ways. She does not remember her family, her people." "She remembers," Tom said carefully. "She's just scared. Something terrible happened to her before she came here. She needs time to heal." "Time?" The warrior's voice rose with anger. "While my sister's blood cries out for vengeance, while soldiers hunt our people like animals, the girl comes with us. Now." "Uncle," Aiyana whispered, and Tom's heart nearly stopped. Her first word, spoken to the Apache warrior, and yet she clung to Tom's hand like a lifeline. The warrior, her uncle, dismounted and approached slowly. When he spoke again, it was in rapid Apache, his voice alternating between commanding and pleading. Aiyana responded in the same language, her voice small, but growing stronger as they talked. Tom couldn't understand the words, but he could read the emotions playing across both their faces. Grief, love, fear, and something else, a fundamental disagreement about what was best for the child. Finally, the uncle turned back to Tom. "She tells me you have been kind, that you protected her from the blue coats and the townspeople. For this, Nalnish thanks you." "Nalnish," Tom repeated, filing away the name. "She's safe here, I give you my word." "Your word?" Nalnish's laugh was bitter. "Your people's words are like wind. They blow one direction then another. The girl's parents trusted white words. They died for that trust." The sound of approaching horses from the west made everyone turn. Tom's heart sank as he recognized the dust cloud of a larger group, at least a dozen riders coming fast. As they drew closer, he could make out Sheriff Martinez, leading what appeared to be a hastily formed posse from Copper Ridge. "Damn!" Tom muttered under his breath. Nalnish saw them too and barked orders to his warriors in Apache. Immediately they spread out in defensive positions, rifles appearing in their hands as if by magic. The peaceful negotiation had just become a potential massacre. "Carlos!" Tom called out as the posse came within hailing distance. "Easy now. Nobody needs to die here today." Sheriff Martinez held up his hand to halt his men about 50 yards away. Tom could see the fear and uncertainty on their faces. Townspeople who'd probably never been this close to armed Apache warriors. Among them, he recognized the blacksmith, the general store owner, and several ranchers whose hatred of Indians was well known. "Tom McCready!" Martinez called out. "Step away from the child and let us handle this. The girl stays with her family," Nalnish shouted back, his rifle now clearly visible across his saddle. "Like hell she does," one of the posse members yelled. Jake Morrison, whose brother had been killed in an Apache raid 2 years prior. "That's a white man's child now. She belongs with civilized people." The insult hit Nalnish like a physical blow. He raised his rifle, and immediately the other Apache warriors followed suit. The posse responded in kind, and suddenly Tom found himself standing in the middle of what was about to become a bloodbath. "Wait!" Tom stepped forward, his arms raised. "Everyone just wait!" But Aiyana had moved too, running not toward either group of armed men, but directly to Tom. She wrapped her small arms around his waist and looked up at him with eyes full of desperate pleading. "Please," she whispered, her second word as precious and fragile as the first. "Don't let them take me." The simple request, spoken in perfect English, carried across the yard in the sudden silence. Every man present, Apache and white alike, stared at the child who had just revealed that she understood everything that had been said. Tom looked down at her upturned face, then at Nalnish, whose expression had shifted from anger to profound confusion. Then he looked at the posse, several of whom were muttering among themselves about half-breed tricks and savage deception. In that moment, Tom McCready realized that the choice he'd been avoiding for 6 days could no longer be postponed. The girl's fate, and possibly his own life, hung in the balance of whatever he said next. "She's not going anywhere," Tom said quietly, his hand resting protectively on Aiyana's shoulder. "Not with anyone. Not until she's ready to choose for herself." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind whistling through the desert sage and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. 2 worlds had collided in his ranch yard, and Tom stood at the epicenter, a child's life balanced on the edge of his decision. The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Tom could feel the weight of every gun, trained on the small group huddled near his porch. Aiyana pressed against his side, Nalnish's warriors spread in defensive positions, and the Copper Ridge posse growing more agitated by the minute. The storm clouds overhead seemed to mirror the tension below, pregnant with violence waiting to be unleashed. Sheriff Martinez dismounted slowly, his hands deliberately visible. "Tom, you're putting everyone in danger here. That child needs to be in proper custody while we sort this out legally." "Whose law?" Nalnish demanded, his rifle still ready. "White man's law that says Apache children belong to strangers? The girl is blood of my blood. She comes home. She's been living with savages long enough." Jake Morrison spat from the posse. "Look at her, dressed like a heathen, can't even speak proper English." "I speak English fine," Aiyana said clearly, her young voice cutting through the heated exchange like a knife. "I just chose not to speak to people who hate me." The simple statement stunned everyone into momentary silence. Tom felt a surge of pride at her courage, even as his heart ached for the wisdom no 8-year-old should possess. "You see," Morrison continued unfazed, "she's been poisoned against her own kind. Needs proper Christian upbringing to cure her of savage ways." Nalnish's face contorted with rage. "Savage? Your soldiers who killed her parents, who burned our camp while children slept, they are savage." "That's enough!" Tom's voice boomed across the yard, surprising himself with its authority. "Every one of you shut your mouths and listen." He stepped forward, keeping Aiyana close beside him. This child has been through hell. Her parents are dead, her world's been torn apart, and now you all want to tear her apart too. Well, I won't have it. Tom, Martinez said carefully, you can't harbor a fugitive. Fugitive? Tom's laugh was harsh. She's 8 years old, Carlos. What crime has she committed besides surviving? The territorial government has procedures, one of the posse members began. The territorial government, Tom interrupted, will put her in some mission school where they'll beat the Apache out of her and try to make her into something she's not. Or worse, they'll ship her back east where she'll die of loneliness and broken spirit. Nalnish nodded grimly. The white man speaks truth. We have seen what happens to our children in their schools. They return as strangers, belonging to neither world. And if she goes with you? Tom challenged. Back to a life of running and hiding, constant war with the cavalry. What kind of future is that for a child? Better than slavery to white ways, Nalnish replied. But Tom could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall, turning the dust to mud. Tom felt time slipping away, knowing that if this standoff continued much longer, someone would lose their nerve, and blood would flow. There's another way, he said suddenly, an idea forming. Aiyana, tell me something. When you think about being safe, about being happy, what do you see? The girl looked up at him with those wise, dark eyes. I see Uncle Nalnish teaching me to track rabbits. I see my grandmother's hands making cornbread. She paused, then added softly, I see you reading to me from your books. I see Bessie letting me help milk her. I see both worlds. Nalnish's stern expression cracked slightly. Child, you cannot live in both worlds. You must choose. Why? Aiyana asked with the devastating simplicity of youth. Why can't I have both families? Tom's heart hammered as the radical idea took shape. What if she could? What if we found a way for her to belong to both worlds instead of being torn between them? Impossible, Morrison sneered. You can't make a savage into a civilized person part-time. But you could make a bridge, Tom said, ignoring the bigot and speaking directly to Nalnish. What if Aiyana spent part of the year with her Apache family, learning her heritage, her language, her customs, and part of the year here, learning to read and write, learning how to navigate the white world that's coming whether we like it or not? Sheriff Martinez stepped closer, intrigued despite himself. You're talking about some kind of shared custody arrangement? I'm talking about giving a child the chance to be whole, Tom said firmly. She's Apache and she's American. She's warrior blood, and she's also smart enough to learn any skill you put in front of her. Why should she have to choose between the parts of herself? The rain was falling steadier now, and several of the posse members were shifting restlessly. But Nalnish had dismounted and was walking slowly toward them, his weathered face thoughtful. You would do this, white man? Share the child with her blood family? I'd do whatever's best for her, Tom said honestly, even if it breaks my heart. Nalnish stopped just a few feet away, studying Tom with sharp eyes. And when the other whites say you harbor a savage child, when they turn against you for this? Tom glanced at the posse, seeing the hostility on most faces, but also catching a flicker of something else in Sheriff Martinez's expression, perhaps respect, or at least understanding. Then I'll face that when it comes, Tom said, but I won't abandon her to save myself grief. Aiyana stepped forward, looking between Tom and her uncle with desperate hope. Uncle, I want to learn the old stories. I want to know about Mother's people, but I also want to learn to read the books that tell about the whole world. She took Tom's hand and Nalnish's hand, trying to pull them together. Please, I need both of you. For a long moment, the only sounds were the pattering rain and the restless movements of horses. Then Nalnish slowly extended his hand toward Tom. For 6 moons, she lives with her people. She learns Apache ways, speaks Apache words, knows Apache stories. Tom grasped the offered hand. And for 6 months, she learns reading, writing, arithmetic. She learns how to live in both worlds so she can choose her own path when she's grown. This is madness, Morrison exploded. You can't trust savages to honor any agreement. The only savages I see Aiyana said clearly, are the people who want to hurt children for being different. Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his voice carrying official weight. If both parties agree to this arrangement and the child consents, I don't see any law being broken. Tom McCready is a respected citizen, and the girl's family has a legitimate claim. You can't be serious, Carlos, Morrison protested. I'm serious about preventing bloodshed in my county, Martinez replied firmly. This seems like the best solution for everyone. Thunder crashed overhead as if sealing the agreement. Tom looked down at Aiyana, who was smiling for the first time since he'd found her. You sure about this, little bird? It won't be easy living between two worlds. It'll be easier than living in no world at all, she said with wisdom beyond her years. As the storm broke in earnest and the various groups began to disperse, the posse grudgingly, the Apache warriors with cautious approval, Tom realized he'd just committed himself to the most complicated 6 years of his life. But looking at Aiyana's face, bright with hope and possibility, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes the best solutions weren't about choosing sides. Sometimes they were about building bridges strong enough to hold the weight of love. 1 year later, the autumn wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant snow as Tom McCready stood on his porch, watching for familiar riders on the horizon. Aiyana had been with Nalnish's band for the past 6 months, learning the Apache ways as promised, and today marked her return to the ranch for the winter season. Tom's weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his hat, not from age or cold, but from the anticipation of seeing the child who had become his daughter in all but blood. The arrangement had tested everyone involved. The people of Copper Ridge had initially ostracized Tom, refusing to sell him supplies and spreading rumors about the Indian lover who harbored savages. But Sheriff Martinez had stood firm in his support, and gradually a few reasonable voices began to emerge. Mrs. Patterson, whose own family had suffered from Apache raids, surprised everyone by defending Tom's choice after meeting Aiyana during one of her visits to town. That child has more grace and intelligence than half the adults in this territory, she'd declared in the general store, silencing the gossips. If more people tried understanding instead of hating, we might actually have peace someday. The distant dust cloud Tom had been watching resolved into 3 riders, Nalnish, one of his warriors, and a small figure on a painted pony that Tom barely recognized. Aiyana sat her horse with the confident grace of someone born to the saddle, her long black hair braided with traditional Apache ornaments. She wore a beautifully beaded dress that spoke of hours of patient work by the women of her tribe, but across her saddle was a cloth bag that Tom knew contained the books she'd insisted on taking with her. As they approached the ranch yard, Aiyana's formal Apache composure cracked, and she broke into a brilliant smile. "Tom!" she called out, urging her pony faster. Tom stepped down from the porch, his own grin threatening to split his weathered face. When Aiyana dismounted and ran to him, he swept her up in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. "Welcome home, little bird," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Lord, you've grown." 3 inches, Aiyana said proudly, pulling back to look at his face. "Grandmother measured me against the mark on the oak tree. And look," she held out her hands, showing calluses from traditional women's work. "I can weave baskets now and tan hides, and I know 17 different plants for medicine." 17? Tom whistled appreciatively. "That's more than Doc Henderson knows." Nalnish dismounted more slowly, his expression unreadable as he approached. The year had been difficult for him, too, watching his sister's daughter ride away every 6 months, trusting a white man to care for her properly. But he could see the joy in Aiyana's face, the healthy glow of a child who felt secure in being loved. "She has learned well," Nalnish said formally. "She can track game, find water in the desert, and she knows the old stories of our people. But," he paused, his weathered face showing a hint of amusement, "she also taught my youngest son to count using white man's numbers, and she has been asking many questions about the iron horses that cross the desert." Tom chuckled. "That's my little bird, Always curious about everything. He looked seriously at Nalnish. How is she with the other children? Does she fit in? At first, some called her white-touched, Nalnish admitted. But when raiders from another tribe threatened our camp, she helped organize the defense using lessons you taught her about fortification. The other children now see her as someone who brings strength from both worlds. Aiyana beamed at the praise, then tugged on Tom's sleeve. I have something to show you. Uncle Nalnish and I worked on it together. She ran to her pony and carefully extracted a leather-bound object from her saddlebags. When she handed it to Tom, he realized it was a journal, the pages filled with her careful handwriting in both English and Apache script. It's the stories, she explained excitedly. All the old Apache stories that grandmother tells, but written down so they won't be lost. Uncle Nalnish helped me learn the symbols, and you taught me how to make the letters neat and clear. Tom flipped through the pages, marveling at the meticulous work. Stories of Coyote the Trickster, tales of the mountain spirits, legends of Apache heroes, all preserved in a hybrid script that honored both traditions. This is remarkable, Aiyana, he said softly. You've created something entirely new. It's what I am, she said simply. Something new. Apache and American, traditional and modern. I don't have to choose anymore. I can be all of it. As they talked, another dust cloud appeared on the horizon, and Tom recognized Sheriff Martinez approaching with a single companion. When they drew closer, Tom was surprised to see that the companion was a woman in Eastern dress, clearly not a local resident. Martinez dismounted and tipped his hat. Afternoon, Tom. Nalnish. He gestured to the woman. This is Miss Sarah Whitman from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She's here about Aiyana. Tom's protective instincts immediately flared, and he stepped slightly in front of Aiyana. What's the Bureau want with her? Miss Whitman, a severe-looking woman in her 40s, consulted a leather portfolio. We've received reports about irregular custody arrangements involving a Native American child. The Bureau has strict policies about the education and placement of Indian children. The child is being educated, Nalnish said coldly, by her family and by those who care for her. Mr. Nalnish, is it? Miss Whitman's tone was patronizing. I'm sure you mean well, but the Bureau has established proper schools for Indian children. They need to be taught useful trades and Christian values, not primitive superstitions. Aiyana stepped forward before either man could respond. Ma'am, I can read and write in 2 languages. I know arithmetic, geography, and history. I can survive in the wilderness, tend injuries with traditional medicine, and I'm learning to manage a ranch. What exactly do you think your schools could teach me that I'm not already learning? Miss Whitman blinked, clearly not expecting such articulate defiance from a 9-year-old. Well, proper deportment for one thing, and you need to learn your place in civilized society. My place, Aiyana said with dangerous quiet, is wherever I choose to make it. And I choose to make it in both worlds. Sheriff Martinez cleared his throat. Miss Whitman, perhaps you should know that this arrangement has the full support of local law enforcement. The child is thriving, the community tensions have decreased significantly, and there have been no incidents of violence since this agreement was reached. Furthermore, Tom added, pulling out a legal document, I've filed formal adoption papers with the territorial court. Aiyana is legally my daughter, with her uncle Nalnish listed as co-guardian. Everything's been done proper and legal. Miss Whitman studied the papers with obvious frustration. This is highly irregular. The Bureau's mission, Aiyana interrupted, is to kill the Indian to save the man. But I don't need killing, ma'am. I need growing, and I'm doing that just fine between my 2 families. Nalnish placed a proud hand on his niece's shoulder. The child speaks with wisdom beyond her years. Perhaps the Bureau should listen to the people it claims to serve. Miss Whitman looked around at the faces surrounding her. Tom's determined protectiveness, Nalnish's quiet dignity, Martinez's official support, and most importantly, Aiyana's confident self-possession. Finally, she closed her portfolio with a sharp snap. I'll file my report stating that the current arrangement appears adequate, she said stiffly. But the Bureau will be monitoring the situation. As she and Martinez rode away, Tom, Nalnish, and Aiyana stood together in the ranch yard, united by their shared victory. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Tom of the first evening he'd found a frightened child hiding in his barn. "You know," Tom said thoughtfully, "there's going to be more challenges ahead, more people who don't understand what we're trying to do here." "Let them come," Aiyana said with quiet confidence. "I know who I am now. I'm your daughter, Uncle Nalnish's niece, and my own person. Nobody can take that away from me." Nalnish nodded slowly. "The child has found her path. It is not the old way or the new way, but her way. Perhaps that is what the future looks like, not choosing between worlds, but building bridges between them." And as the three of them walked toward the house, where lamplight already glowed warm and welcoming in the windows, Tom realized that family wasn't just about blood or tradition or law. It was about love, strong enough to create new possibilities, brave enough to stand against prejudice, and wise enough to honor the past while building the future. Behind them, Aiyana's pony nickered softly to Tom's horses, and overhead the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Apache stars and American stars shining down on a child who belonged to both worlds and was diminished by neither. The little Apache girl, who had once hidden silent and terrified in his barn, had become a bridge between cultures, a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred, when they chose to build rather than divide. And Tom McCready, the lonely rancher who had thought his capacity for love died with his first family, had learned that the heart could always make room for one more child, one more chance at redemption, one more opportunity to choose hope over fear. In the growing darkness, their laughter echoed across the desert, carrying on the wind like a promise of better days to come.